welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, well, everyone, welcome to the first episode of The Idiot Cosmos. I'm Tom, your host, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, my good friend, Seán Murray. So, Seán, you are a very distinguished historian and archaeologist, so you've got a lot to talk about, I'm sure, and a lot to tell us about your career to date and all of your interests. So, do you want to go ahead and give us a brief introduction?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom, for that introduction. I wouldn't say now I'm a great or distinguished one, but I suppose maybe around Laois, I probably have fairly good knowledge of archaeology and history and that kind of thing. So, yeah, absolutely. I suppose my story began with all this in Sligo IT back in 2005, I think. So I would have studied 2006. Would have started my college degree up there in archaeology and kind of had a love ever since for it,
So, yeah, we're just adjusting the levels here. It's our first episode, and we're all getting adjusted to it. But that's very interesting. So, what brought you to this? What gave you the archaeology bug?
I suppose when I was younger, like I was always kind of digging around in the soil and looking at fossils and all that kind of stuff and collecting loads of rocks, and I kind of always had an interest in history and I suppose how history was used to manipulate people.
Okay, right. It's
Yeah.
very
But I
important.
suppose we'd probably say it started off with dinosaurs anyway, I suppose.
Okay, as far as we know,
Yeah.
no ancient aliens.
Not yet anyway.
We're not the History Channel here. Not yet.
Yeah.
But that's interesting, yeah, because I suppose like the saying goes, like the victors write the history books, and I suppose we're always kind of recodifying history, over time, because we're learning more about it as we kind of delve deeper into the layers and the different strata, I suppose, And
Yeah, but I suppose, I mean, what do they say about history? It's kind of written through the lens of the time that we're in, that kind of way. So
yeah.
it's very true, like, and it can be manipulated for maybe current or future goals going forward,
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. Like historical manipulation. So do you want to go deeper on that, or is it too much of a hot topic?
Maybe we'll get back to it later. We might just start off with the easier stuff first.
We're not going nuclear yet.
Yeah.
But I find that interesting though, just to talk about history, because it's kind of like telling ourselves stories about ourselves, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I suppose history gives you a sense of identity and a sense of culture, a sense of where you're from and that kind of thing, and kind of a sense of community. Like, I mean, it's ingrained in society. Like, it's important. It's an identifying factor, I suppose, for people, and it's important to just tell the story correctly. Like,
I think that's very important, because I think today we live in a world of social media, the internet, and I think there's so many half-truths and untruths out there. We have
absolutely
the famous term fake news,
yeah,
and how that kind of has exploded over the last so many years. And
no, I agree 100%. And it's kind of with social media. I mean, you could put up a post on social media, and you could change. You could change the text or wording in it very quickly. It's almost Orwellian kind of stuff, where they're reading from the video, or they're using the video prompters and stuff like that, and they're erasing bits that they don't want. I mean, that's I suppose social media for you.
Yeah, it's very selective. I suppose we talk about big tech, and obviously that kind of doesn't necessarily dovetail with history in the conventional sense, but the idea that there are kind of commissars of information today that decide what people are allowed to know. And that's a very controversial subject, because I suppose a lot of people out there will trust the mainstream media by default. They'll say, well, look, these people are newspapers of record, they are the news outlets, the big news corporations, whatever.
Well, for instance, I'll just give you a small example, I suppose, from history. I mean, during the famine in Ireland, The newspapers didn't really report the peasant story, if you like.
Right.
It was largely just, I mean, the peasants were illiterate, so they wouldn't have read the newspapers anyway.
Yeah.
And the people that did read the newspapers probably didn't want to hear much about people starving in the streets and stuff like that. So, I mean, if you go back through the newspaper archives and you look up, the effects of famine or how people were at the time, there's very little kind of recorded print, if you like, on the famine, like, and yes, our population was reduced from 8 million to 5, I think, or thereabouts.
Yes, drastic.
So it's amazing, they'd rather cover stories like the great yacht armada up the north or so. I can't remember I think it was Lord Londonderry or something like that. Had a big regatta up in Lough Swilly, at the height of the famine, They were the kind of stories that were kind of portrayed. Now, I mean, there is some stories there, but I mean, the cataclysmic effect of the famine has largely gone unnoticed in the print media of the time.
Would you say that the famine itself is kind of a misnomer? Because over the years, and I remember even growing up, we had books like Under the Hawthorn Tree, and they, that sought to tell the stories of the actual people that were suffering at the time, and they were, obviously disenfranchised and dislocated by the famine. But, as history has taught us since then, it was, people tend to call it the Grey Hunger nowadays. It's probably more fashionable nowadays. So rather than a famine, because as far as I understand, the story was that there was food available, and that this fellow called Trevelyan, who was in charge of maybe supplying grains to the people of Ireland, actually held that back in big silos. And a lot of people starved when they actually could have survived. And the actual idea of the potato being obviously the staple diet of the peasantry is probably true to a large extent, but still it simplifies the story to such an extent that just because of a potato blight in 1847, that this resulted in people starving when there were other solutions, and the British powers at the time didn't want to help.
Yeah, I mean, that's true as well. I mean, nobody's doubting there was a potato blight, I suppose, but there was alternative foods. And, of course, a lot of those foods were, transferred by army convoy back to the UK at the time, So, I mean, there was no famine in the UK, during the Irish famine as such, because they had access to other types of food. So, but I suppose, just coming back to your first point there, I suppose the whole idea of the famine and the Great Hunger, as we call it now, I mean, if it wasn't for a kind of a nationalist sentiment in Ireland, that kind of period in Irish history kind of probably wouldn't have been. It was used differently, I suppose, with the Great Hunger and things like that,
So you think that maybe the censorship of the time, and had things continued on a particular route, that we would have never have talked about it, wouldn't have been. There wouldn't be any discourse about it today had history kind of played out slightly differently.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I suppose there is a thing then as well. I mean, people kind of wanted to forget about it as well, and there was. I mean, it's probably one of the, in terms of humans and to see fellow humans starving to death on the street. It's probably one of those kind of things that you don't want to remember, that kind of way. But I suppose, as Ireland was trying to fight for its independence from the UK, things like the famine were kind of brought to the fore again. And it just, it's a way, I mean, it should be remembered, absolutely, and but there's other parts of history that should be remembered too, and it's not.
Yeah, I think it's kind of true on both sides, because if you think about, I suppose, War of Independence and everything, and how a lot of knowledge was lost, or historical record. Like we had up until recently, I mean, we didn't have access to a lot of historical records, and that was destroyed in 1922, I believe. There was a great fire in Dublin.
Yeah.
And it's only since then there's been an initiative to recover some of that and actually put it there for, obviously, public consumption. So, but I always find it's interesting how a lot of the great houses were destroyed at that time as well. So it was kind of an erasure of empire, I suppose, post 1922. And Ireland Ireland seems to go through periods of like forgetting its past, because I find it fascinating how, if you think about the oral tradition in Ireland, this notion of the invasion cycle, and how, at various times in history, and it's obviously not written down, it's part of the oral tradition, we have had we had successive invasions of Ireland by foreign powers, that peoples that would have come along and established a new order in Ireland each time. So I think Ireland's always been maybe subjected to that over time, and there's always been this kind of, dare I say, historical reset, in effect.
Yeah, well, I mean, Ireland, I suppose it's on the western periphery of Europe, and we've, there could be kind of invasions going on in Eastern Europe like we have at the moment, and you get a population flooding into Western Europe. I suppose Ireland was probably the last kind of bastion, I suppose, or last stop on the map, really. Maybe Iceland as well, but I suppose the climate in Iceland wasn't the best. But I suppose, like people like the Vikings have come to Ireland. If we rewind back the clock, maybe I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, we learnt in school that the Vikings were marauders and they killed the Catholics, and that was the narrative. Not kill the Catholics, but I mean they killed the monks, and they
pillaged and plundered.
Yeah, pillaged and plundered. But now I suppose there's almost a different narrative now with the Vikings. That they were kind of almost globalists, to brought finance market into Ireland. They're more sophisticated than this barbarian image that we have. And then we have TV shows then like the Vikings that kind of I suppose portray them in a different light again.
Do you think that because of modern media and TV, obviously a lot of people want to sit down and read a very dry historical text, that if you can romanticize it and glamorize it, that you create almost like a new narrative around it?
Absolutely. Like, I suppose the thing with Vikings as well, I mean, they're a European kind of a tribe as well, so it would suit kind of almost an EU narrative, if you like.
Okay. So the Vikings are propaganda, basically, is what we're saying. This is the big revelation.
Well, maybe. I don't know. It's always something to kind of consider anyway. Anyway. So
but I think what you're saying is very interesting, because it's how, like we're saying, how you recodify history, how you, it's almost like history is taken in and kind of chewed up and spun around and processed, and it comes out the other side as a big sausage that people kind of cut into and have a slice of and go, that's history. Consume it.
Well, for instance, I mean, there was a big uproar recently in Ireland there about the RIC. There was a couple of people who wanted to do some presentations or some documentaries on the RIC and commemorate the RIC for effectively being one of the first police forces in the world. That operated in Ireland. Now, I mean, the RIC, I mean, there were probably most of them were just honest, hard-working, decent people, that kind of way. But it didn't suit the narrative, I suppose, with a lot of people, because they're, I suppose, considered as part of the crown in Ireland and things like that. So
there's resentment.
There's resentment, but the funny thing about it is, I mean, a lot of the RIC officers or whatever went straight into the Garda Síochána when the Garda Síochána was formed, but that's overlooked.
So that's selective memory.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I mean, we should commemorate all of our history, really.
Yeah, I think it's only fair. I think one thing about Ireland is, as we were saying about kind of historical resets, we tend to junk a lot of unwanted, unsavoury kind of, I suppose, historical fact in favour of creating maybe a kind of a more cuddly version of it that we can easily consume in school and on TV, and say, well, there was a certain bad period and then the good period came along and everyone kind of is happy and progressive today. So it's never quite simple, and I think the one thing about history we always kind of learn is that it's always very complicated and there's never any easy answers with it. So people mightn't always want to know the truth. They want to know a version of the truth, and one that suits everybody is the one that's kind of promoted. But I find it interesting when we're talking about, like, the Vikings. And I'm reading a very interesting book at the minute called Phantom Islands by this fellow called Dirk Lysimer.
Okay.
And he's a
very Viking-ish name.
He's a German author, apparently. Okay. But one thing in it that's kind of piqued my interest, and always has, is the legend of High Brazil, if you've heard of that. So this would be what was, I suppose, the ancient land off the western coast of Ireland. And I remember going to a talk some years ago with the storyteller Eddie Lenihan in Galway, and he did a very good presentation on the legends surrounding High Brazil and what that could have been, because I suppose High Brazil, because it's part of the oral tradition and that kind of history, there's nothing really concrete about it. It's a kind of a mystical island, a Shangri-La type of place off the western coast, and I suppose in a sense it's kind of been absorbed by the fairy faith tradition, and this idea of the Tuatha Danann, who were one of the invading tribes that came along back in prehistoric times and took over Ireland for a time. But it's interesting in the book, actually talks about how it's the original records of it date back to the 14th century. So actually it's a Portolan map, so an early maritime chart, and this geographer called Angelino Dulcert, who came from the Balearic island of Majorca, he actually placed it just off the coast of the western coast, yeah. So, but because there were no proper kind of means of navigation at the time, it was always just kind of vaguely kind of placed there, thereabouts. And apparently this Captain John Nisbet of Killybegs in 1674, he actually spent a couple of days there with his men, apparently. Maybe they were juiced up on something, who knows, kind of early poaching or something. But they actually, according to the story, they actually landed and spent a night there, made a camp. And when they made a fire there and slept overnight, they actually felt this kind of, what they call a clamour come over them. So they were kind of a feeling of doom or something anyways, and they took off. But they returned the next day, and they actually supposedly found some old men in rags on the beach where they had been. And they said that they had, because all that was there on the island when they'd landed was a kind of a dilapidated old castle, by the looks of it, a ruin, and they couldn't actually get inside that. So the men told them that they had actually freed them. They were under some kind of spell, and they had been trapped there, but by lighting the fire, they had set them free, and they actually took them back to the mainland. So it was a kind of an Usheen type story, I suppose, and this idea of, like, if you set foot on these islands, perhaps these mysterious ghostly islands, that you could be trapped there and you could be cursed to roam them, and maybe join the other crowd, as they call them. So
I suppose they were kind of seen as liminal places in the landscape or what have you.
Exactly.
It's interesting. And it's mad, really, with the High Brazil story, that some say the country of Brazil got its name from.
I've heard that. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It's crazy to think that there's no evidence for this island now today. Like, now that's not to say it didn't exist. It could have been, who knows? It could have been like a Surtsey kind of a volcano or something like that. That's came up under the sea and has since submerged or exploded again or something, Well,
what's interesting is in the book, he details, and I hadn't read this before, but apparently the island of High Brazil consisted of concentric rings with a kind of a main, I suppose, settlement in the centre. Now, if you look at the legend of Atlantis, that often talks about, it's quite the same, and also as well, as the stories kind of were spread and retold, High Brazil actually began to move further out west towards the Azores, and that's where some theorists would put Atlantis today. So I think that's fascinating. As you're saying about High Brazil gaining its name, or Brazil gaining its name for High Brazil, would it be possible that maybe, and we're kind of getting into, I suppose, Graham Hancock territory here, this idea of, I suppose, the idea that there was a great cataclysm 12,000 years ago, and that the survivors of this supposed advanced civilization made it to maybe South America or perhaps to Western Europe and became the cultures that evolved there during the Holocene, which
it's possible. I mean, I suppose there's a few different theories on migration to South America. I suppose from Alaska, kind of China, places like that. It's hard to know, I suppose, with the high Brazil. I mean, there was mermaids spotted back then. There was like kind of various different sea creatures, and I suppose if you're out on a boat in the Atlantic, I mean, you're going to try and almost invent some stories to keep your mind ticking along. It can probably be a very kind of claustrophobic kind of a place, given that you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean. You could be hit by a storm at any minute, so maybe sailors just kind of came up with these kind of stories along the way and kind of helped the crews get through that, and plus the fact, I suppose, they may have been eating or scurvy and things like that, or they may have been eating grain that had what's that spore on it? I can't think of it now. It's can't think of the name.
That would produce hallucinations.
Yes,
basically.
that's what I can't think of the name.
Yeah.
But different things like that, I suppose, kind of might all contribute to these stories. But again, I mean, listen, there could have been an island out there, volcanic island, that's now submerged. That kind of way.
So the big question is: do you believe in Atlantis?
I don't know. I do believe that that back in antiquity. I mean, look at the Antipeden, Antikythera. Is it the mechanism?
The Antikythera mechanism. Yeah,
that's the one.
Yeah,
different things like that. Like, I mean, the Dark Ages in Europe. I mean, there was a lot of knowledge kind of destroyed or lost forever. The Great Library in
Alexandria.
The university in Baghdad. I mean, there was a lot of these places were destroyed, knowledge completely lost. Was there an Atlantis? I don't know, but there may have been advanced civilizations there. I mean, for instance, the Minoans, they were very advanced.
They had cart tracks, didn't they? Actually, in their islands that people can't figure out what they were actually used for, and it could have been for transporting goods and
absolutely. I mean, the whole Minoan civilization. I mean, they controlled pretty much the entire Eastern Mediterranean, if not beyond that.
We had the Phoenicians as well, of course, which would have preceded them.
And then I suppose the big volcanic explosion on Tierra pretty much wiped out the Minoan civilization. So I mean, it's possible that cataclysmic event probably wiped out a lot of their culture and knowledge and what have you. So I mean, maybe the Minoans were the Atlantis. I don't know.
No, I think it's a fascinating subject because I mean, it's open to conjecture, and I suppose a person like yourself who's an academic, you prefer facts. You want something that you can measure. You want empirical data, basically, that you can work with, rather than wild that's notions.
That's true, but I mean, the oral tradition is very important as well, and that's not quite empirical data either. I mean, some of the stories are fanciful, but I mean, there's merit and there's truth to the story, and you can kind of unravel it a bit and kind of, I suppose, get into the consciousness of how people thought of events and the supernatural and what have you back then. So it's an important facet of history is to have a look at the oral traditions as well. It's important because I mean, a lot of the history was, it would have been written down by the literate classes, I suppose, and you're only getting their version of history then. So I mean, the oral history it's a nice way of kind of supplementing that, I suppose.
No, it's such a broad subject. And it extends beyond history because it encompasses so much more, anthropology and everything. So, I mean, I suppose we could sit here for days and kind of contemplate what went on prior to recorded history. And of course, personally, I mean, I suppose there probably was something civilization during the Pleistocene,
Mm.
whatever that consisted
Absolutely, it could be under the Black Sea for all we know. Like,
of.
you know,
Yeah,
I mean, that sea only formed 12,000 years ago. You know,
yeah,
the whole story of the biblical flood, I suppose, comes
yeah,
from the Black Sea, and
yeah,
you know, the Mediterranean basically poured into the Bosporus and probably submerged civilizations there too. You know,
yeah, yeah.
so it's really hard to know.
I suppose it's the displacement of people as well.
Like.
Like just as we were talking about the famine times and how people were, taken out of where they lived, and some of them didn't survive, and so a lot of them had to migrate as well to like further afield to America and Australian places. And so they take a lot of their traditions with them, and I suppose in a sense they form part of the fabric of the new society that they land in.
Mm-hmm.
And that in a sense can change things. It can create its own folklore,
Absolutely,
because you have syncretic religions, I suppose, that have sprung up over the centuries, and they're a result of probably mixing Christianity with other forms of religions and just other religions in general, and creating something, a new tradition for those people that intermingle.
Yeah, but I suppose America is a good case in point there. I mean, again, you know, it's the last stop, kind of west, I suppose, you know, from Europe, and the old migration routes, you know, from Russia into Europe and Ireland, and I suppose, you know, the developments in trade and maritime and shipping and stuff like that. I suppose people could get to America then, you know, that kind of way. But it's a good case in point for kind of a mixture of all cultures, all European cultures, languages, religions. Kind of like it's like a little kind of pressure cooker, maybe. I suppose,
A mixing pot. I think I remember reading once about how that's how America has looked on. It's the greatest social experiment in history, and how you bring all these disparate people from different parts of the world, and how they all blend together in a sense. Sometimes not so well, sometimes very well, and the result is what we have today. And
the result is we have like neocons basically calling the shots and trying to complete their hegemony of the world. So I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, there's different schools of thought, obviously, on that. And
I mean, if you have so many diverse kind of groups, I suppose, does that lead to powerlessness in society, or would it be best to have kind of one strong, unified ideology? Would that make society more powerful? I don't know.
Well, I think over time, and people just living together, clustering together, they form their own identity as well. And I suppose the United States has its identity today because of that, and there's a lot of different voices in that. I mean, a lot of Irish, a lot of Scots, a lot of English people that would have migrated.
Well, to quote Leonard Cohen, I'll just say, America is the cradle of the best and of the worst.
Right.
I think it's a very good quote.
Yeah, well, it's a good point, because I mean, look, today it could be the subject of a huge anthropological study one day, especially American. It's going through its own troubles and its own issues. I mean, some people might say it's even convulsing at the minute, because it's doesn't quite know what way it wants to move going forward. I mean, it's very, I suppose the politics in America. It's very polarized nowadays. You have a right-left
two-party dictatorship, I call it.
Yeah, well, I mean, people, if they're cynical about politics, and a lot of people are nowadays, is that they kind of see that it's, it's a no-win situation for some people, because they feel that the two parties that might be, vying for power all the time are more or less the same heads,
Yeah, well, that's it. So, I mean, do they represent the people, or do they represent big business, like thing?
Yeah, well, it's like getting back to our initial conversation about social media and big tech. And I suppose the one thing that has changed over the last 20 years especially is how, I suppose, we have, like, we're talking about globalization, and these globalists maybe as well that are, pulling the strings, maybe, some people argue.
But I suppose, looking back on history, I mean, there's always been these kind of big players, going back all the way back, like, I mean, you have the merchants in Venice, and you have, the pharaohs in Egypt and different things. There was always that kind of, like a hierarchy that was kind of governing the dominion, if you like.
Yeah, sure. But I think what's changed.
You'd have the odd kind of usurper like Alexander the Great or something like that comes along and throws everything on its head for a while, and then it just kind of goes back to where it was again, you know. So
Yeah. Well, I suppose, I mean, that's what's kind of happened politically.
you could probably stick Adolf Hitler in there as well.
Yeah, there's been a lot of like strong figures, Stalin, you know, obviously, and then, you know, they're very kind of controversial figures, obviously, by today's standards as well. So it's, I think the way it's gone in the last 20 years is that this kind of more globalized culture has emerged through social media because there are no borders in social media.
Yeah, good point.
Everyone's part of like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and because of that, it all seems to dissolve. And what you might have, and I
wait for the metaverse. That's what I say.
Well, that'll be the next thing, won't it? Because the idea is that you'll be buying virtual real estate, perhaps. And that totally separate, a totally separate. I suppose it's not entirely new because if you look at the way, say, even with say Second Life, which was a very popular computer game some time ago, people are actually buying real estate, and even some of the big role-playing games, everything that people trade.
Sims and things like that.
Sims, all these things, but you end up trading real money for virtual items, and it seems kind of ridiculous to people that are uninitiated into that. But
for Bitcoin and stuff like that is another example. It's not like you know, it's crazy, but I mean, there's no doubt in it. I mean, the power of social media is unbelievable, really.
Yeah.
You know, it's for such a virtual thing, it's almost tangible in the reality that we're in. You know, so, I mean, if you look at people on Facebook and influencers, they call them, and things like that, you know, they do wield a lot of cultural kind of, you know, respect, I suppose, you know, if you could call it that.
Yeah, you know, but that's it, like having a
But that's coming from something that's not even in reality, virtually, like, and coming full swing back into reality. I mean, it's, you know, they're influencing people to wear different types of clothes or whatever the case may be, and you know, it's a funny dimension to the world we're living in, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's an evolution of the cult of celebrity in a sense, because what you're doing is you're kind of taking people that are famous for being famous, as the old kind of catchphrase goes, with people that, I suppose initially this phenomenon started with reality TV at the turn of the millennium, I suppose, and that changed the conversation on how people are famous and why people have influence. And before, I suppose it was people that were respected because they were intellectuals or academics, or people that were famous because they were, you know, movie stars, or famous in the arts in a different way, or leaders as well, or anything like that. So, you know, like we have these, you know, as you were saying about Hitler and Stalin, like really hated figures today, like that. You know, they had tremendous power back during the time of the Second World War, and people were completely swayed by their dark charisma, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the time, I mean, they didn't have dark charisma; they had charisma.
Right.
So
okay.
It's a good example of, you know, vita victis, you know, like the victor's race right to history, you know.
Right. Hi everyone, I'm Thomas Byrne, and this is, I suppose, the first episode, well, we'll call it episode 0 of my new podcast, The Idiot Cosmos. Now, what's The Idiot Cosmos, you might ask, and what's it all about, and why is it even needed? Well, I suppose I'd like to be able to speak to a lot of interesting people that might normally not get any kind of traction out there in the wider media. So we'll be exploring a lot of, I suppose, outre ideas and out there subjects, hopefully, but also talking to people that work in, I suppose, in a creative capacity, and that bring a lot of innovative new ideas to the table. I think oftentimes in our modern world, it's all fairly ephemeral, so that ideas are quickly disposed of, and not a lot has much sticking power anymore. So I think, without chasing profundity, I'd like to be able to talk to people that might just, you know, have something deeper to say, rather than the disposable fast fashion of the modern discourse as it is. So I hope you'll join me, because I've got a couple of really good guests lined up to begin, and I think you'll enjoy it. You can join me, the Idiot Cosmos, as we explore the, I suppose, less travelled roads. Thank you. Right, and we're back.
We're back after that short
Yes.
sort of sojourn.
They came for us.
Yeah.
We were censored. So yeah, we were talking about historical narratives, and obviously the way certain figures are perceived, and as you were saying, the charisma of some of these very hated figures such as Hitler and Stalin. What do you make of the other side of the divide then? Because we have obviously America been a huge force during the 20th century, and obviously before that as well. So do you think do you question the received wisdom or the historical narrative there as well? And why do you question, say, Hitler's particular?
Not because I'm a Nazi, just
No.
to get on the record.
Yeah. Neither of us.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it just, I suppose, I just kind of going back to the average German. I mean, was the average German a bad, evil person? I don't think they were. So.
But if they joined the Nazi Party, surely they supported what went on.
I think the Nazi Party had like 8 or 9 million membership, so
Right.
I don't know whether you could actually say that every person that was in the Nazi Party was evil.
Right.
Just in my opinion, anyway. I mean, they were probably caught up in a kind of a whirlwind of propaganda, I suppose, at the time.
Yeah.
And maybe they felt their patriotic duty was to join the Nazi Party or so.
Yeah. I suppose the way Hitler,
for better or for worse, it obviously ended as worse as it could be for them.
Yeah. Well, the idea was after World War One that Germany went through reparations and severe economic depression, and
and that's largely forgotten about, I suppose, as well in the narrative. Like, I mean, there was hyperinflation. I mean, people couldn't get houses. I mean, people were starving. People had no fuel in the wintertime. It's almost kind of like today.
Yeah.
We're heading for that storm again,
Yeah,
so.
because we see with...
And there was also that whole thing, I suppose. There was an ideology out there. I mean, a nationalist ideology. Like, I mean, that was rampant, not just in Germany, but in every country, really, at the time. I mean, even in Ireland, we were just fresh after getting our own independence. There was a kind of a nationalist sentiment in Ireland at the time, and throughout the world, I suppose. So, there's just a whole kind of cataclysmic effect, I suppose, that may have driven people to that kind of far right
ideology.
So.
People get swept along by the events in history. And
absolutely, and I mean, you have the propaganda. Then, I mean, we had propaganda in Ireland here 2 years ago with a pandemic or scamdemic or whatever you want to call it.
We're in very deep controversial territory here, folks. But this is what the Idiot Cosmos is all about. Like, we're going to we're coming up with some very left field ideas. So
I mean, I'm not saying there wasn't a virus. I mean, there clearly was, because I had COVID myself and all that. But it was just all these projections, that people, thousands of people are going to die, and there's going to be refrigeration trucks outside hospitals. And
it was terrifying. We all lived through it. And one thing I remember is that we're talking about propaganda and how we got a lot of video and images from China at the time showing people dropping dead in the streets. And how do we know how much of that was actually doctored or was authentic? And obviously, as history tells us, the WHO then decided that they would drop everything in terms of how they normally deal with outbreaks or pandemics, and they would adopt the Chinese method,
the
which
Chinese
was
lockdown model.
The lockdown model, which nobody remembers fondly, and a lot of people would fear going back into if we got to that stage again. So we obviously, we don't want to, but we recognise that now with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
That
Well, it's a chip that I think it's a bargaining chip down the future. I think that maybe the collective West might use. Whenever they force China to invade Taiwan.
Yeah.
They can say, these are the guys that gave us the virus and the lockdowns and all the rest. It's, I suppose, it was called the China virus there at one point.
Well, that was Donald Trump's particular epithet. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard to know, like, what way things would go that way, like. But
just to pick up, so I had this moment on the train when I looked across and this lady had boarded, and she produced a whole range of disinfectant sprays from her bag. So she had a Dettol spray and all these other brands, and she was just basically spraying all of the upholstery. She wiped her hands with wipes, which people tend to do anyway.
Scrub it up, I call it.
Absolutely. It was overdrive altogether. So to me, that was just a symptom of how crazy things had gotten.
Yeah.
Obviously I have sympathy for the poor lady because she was just terrified. She was terrified of touching the window, touching any of the plastic, anything around her. And when she actually sprayed her seat twice and wiped it down, I didn't know what way. I was, it's like one of those moments where you're kind of embarrassed to look, and then you have to look away, but you're kind of curious enough to look back again and go, is this for real? Am I living in this world right now that's like this? What's become of everything? People's sanity. Was really
taken into the fore, really, wasn't it? With the whole thing, it's just it's just sad to see it, like, just to think that we've come to that kind of a situation, for an airborne virus.
An airborne pathogen that we couldn't really measure, still having to this day have properly isolated. And these are the type of things will get you banned still probably online. So we have to be careful, I suppose, what we do say at the same time. But I think at this stage we should be allowed to debate what went on. We should be able to talk about it openly. But as we were saying, the big tech platforms, the censorship, rampant censorship that's gone on for the past 2 years means that everybody's walking on eggshells around the subject and still feel a little bit hesitant to discuss.
There's a lot of people that bought the propaganda, like, hook, line and sinker, like, and if you try and debate with those kind of people, they'll just look at you in disbelief, that you're conspiracy theorist,
anti-vaxxer
or what have you, COVID denier,
and all these epithets have become so fashionable that even a few years ago, and it's funny because we live in this very progressive society now, and it's about don't offend people and be kind and be nice. And yet there's this divide in society where it's like, well, the other side that might be skeptical of what's going on, they're fair game to be vilified. But everybody else, kid gloves. And I find that really hypocritical.
Absolutely, and anybody that went along with it, for instance, the medical profession, they made plenty of money from it. So that kind of kept them in line. That kept that profession in line. If you've more money on the table, you're bringing home more money. You're going to shut your mouth and get on with it, and buy the narrative and what have you,
But it's kind of a case of a revisionism, reset going on right in our midst. We can see how the received wisdom of the past kind of went out the window. And suddenly when this became a thing, everybody went, no, just stop everything and do like what they're telling us to do now. And to me,
it's kind of like an opening artillery barrage, basically. We got pummeled with COVID. Things have kind of somewhat kind of died down now with COVID anyway. But
they're still saying today, like there's 1,000 cases a day now. So they're drumming up the fear again.
They're drumming up the fear, and it's something they're not going to let go of. It's funny how, like, terrorism, for instance, was completely gone bestly during COVID.
Yeah.
There was no terrorism, you know.
Well, it was more a case of domestic terrorism, I think. That's what kind of evolved in the West. And this
Yeah.
idea that if you were someone that went against the narrative, well, you might as well have been just the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
You know, and it's amazing how, you know, slight adjustment in the vocabulary that we use every day.
Yeah.
And like we talked about how, you know, information can be so simplified and broken down that, you know, you don't need to be, you don't need to think about it. You just have to consume it. And then modern consumer kind of society dictates that.
Absolutely. You know.
But it's all very interesting. But I think for you as a historian yourself, you must look at that aghast and go, well, what will the future history books write about this time? And how will I deal with it? How will I process it? What will I speak about?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, well, I mean, the worst is still to come, in my opinion.
So you're a glass half empty.
Yeah. You know, this is, as I was saying there, I mean, this was the opening artillery barrage.
Yeah. This is the first salvo then, in your opinion?
First salvo, really, like, you know, our individual freedoms, you know, got a bit of a battering during COVID, you know.
Yeah.
And I just think that's deep in the psychic now with people, you know, and, you know, they could turn on the tempo on anything now, really, you know. Climate could be brought into it, or, you know, the new thing now with the war in Russia, like, I mean, they're using that to scare people, like, and, you know, you can't discuss that it's a proxy war between the US and Russia, like, you're not allowed to discuss that, like, because the Russians invaded, they were the ones that invaded Ukraine. But, I mean, if you look back at the history of the two nations, like, I mean, there has been an ongoing conflict there for at least the last 8 years, you know, and my analogy is, you know, if Mexico was as belligerent as Ukraine was to the USA, I mean, I don't think the Americans would think twice about doing what the Russians are doing right now, like, you know. But, you know, like, I mean, these things come and pass, you know, but this whole 2030 agenda, I suppose, is probably, it's
you will own nothing and you will be happy.
Exactly, you know. Whatever that means, nobody knows, but...
Well, we do, because it's the World Economic Forum, and they're telling us exactly what's coming down the pipe, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, you want to get to own your own house or anything like that.
Well,
so
it's this idea of stakeholder capitalism that is being promoted by its head honcho, Mr. Klaus Schwab. And obviously there's a lot of conspiracy swirling around all that story at the minute. And yeah, it's something that I suppose people hopefully in time will have a better understanding of. And yeah,
it's hard to know what the next steps of it are, but I think, you know, we've been softened up with COVID now. So
do you fear that maybe the worst case scenario could be that, you know, historical record is altered so that we never really know the truth?
Well, I mean, what's the historical record going to be in 20 years? I mean, is it going to be on the internet where you can just simply go in and remove words and replace words?
The all digital future.
The digital future, you know. I mean, it's Orwellian stuff again. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, you know, about you know, just being able to edit things out. If things are digital, at least when things are in print, they're in print.
Yeah,
you know, they're kind of almost set in stone. But I suppose the digital record can be doctored and manipulated a lot more easier than print. Now, of course, you could have book burnings, things like that, which they did in the past too.
Right.
And all, you know, try to eradicate the written record with big bonfires of books and stuff like that, which happened.
The Nazis, I believe, did that too.
Yeah, well, I mean, it happened, these kind of book burnings all around Europe at different stages during the French Revolution and different things during the Cromwellian period, you know. You know, so, I mean, listen, we had statues pulled down during COVID with the riots in America, with the racist riots, and, you know, so I mean that's part of our history. Like, we shouldn't just go remove a statue because it doesn't suit the particular narrative of the time, you know. So it's hard to know.
Yeah. In this modern world where people are offended by history and feel very incensed by what still stands, that it's easier to remove that from the record rather than having to deal with it and maybe get a better perspective on things.
Yeah, it's kind of like the whole woke agenda, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had somebody contact me there recently enough, you know, and we're giving out about a heritage plaque that's outside the hospital in Portlaoise, and the plaque says Portlaoise Lunatic Asylum,
Right.
and they wanted to change lunatic. They said it was offensive to anybody with mental health,
Yeah.
you know. But I mean that's what these places were called back in the day, you know.
Yeah.
So if you were to go and remove that now and cancel that name from history, like, you know, you're losing a part of history. I know it's only a name and things like that, you know. It's called a mental hospital now, I suppose.
Yeah, we're not going to call that today, but
Yeah.
in terms of historical context, yeah.
Yeah, like, I mean, and then I suppose, I don't know, there's a whole thing then about the lunatics and the cycle of the moon and different things
Sure.
like that, you know, like, and that goes back into, you know, like the doctrine of the four principles and that kind of stuff, you know, Greek kind of mythology and stuff. So, you know, take the word lunatic out, you lose all that.
Yes.
You know,
yeah. And that's our connection to the ancient world as well.
Absolutely, like, you know.
True language.
Yeah, true language, and, you know, it's just...
Well, you yourself, you've a book on the way, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's been it's been a book in the process now for a while, actually. Kind of started it really as a lockdown project. Still haven't figured out the correct title for it, but it's along the lines of 101 heritage or historic curiosities of County Laois.
Yeah. I've contributed to it as well, of course.
You have indeed, yes.
Yes.
Thanks for that.
I was delighted to do that. So
yeah,
I'm looking forward to seeing the finished product.
Yeah. There's been a good few people now that have contributed towards this. We kind of put the call out there from the Laois Heritage Society for anybody that's interested in submitting an article for the book. And I suppose we got approximately 50 articles that were sent for editing on the book. So and I've kind of thrown another 30 or 40 towards that, so we're nearly at 101. And it'll be a nice book when it comes out. I mean, it stems from, you know, the very earliest origins of County Laois all the way up to, you know, the 19th century or thereabouts, early 20th century, and, you know, they're short, snappy little articles, very interesting, and I'd recommend. I'm hoping to have it out by Christmas, the Heritage Society.
So you're tailoring it for a modern audience, so it has like little bite-sized articles that are easily to digest in short sittings. So this is something that you'd hope maybe would appeal to everybody, the Zoomers to the Boomers, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a book for everyone. I mean, there's a story in the book that would interest anybody that has any interest in reading or what have you. Not necessarily historic information, but cultural and just curiosity kind of stories as well, you know. So, you know, there's a story there about a nun that was murdered with her rosary beads back in the 1880s, I believe, in Portlaoise, you know, by a wandering traveller or so, and he was found guilty of murder. And, you know, it was a big story back then in Portlaoise, like, you know.
Yeah. So this was like a tramp or a vagabond.
Yeah, a vagabond or a tramp, yeah, and he came along, and I think he was seeking some kind of refuge or so in the convent. And I'm not sure exactly what happened, but the nun didn't come out the best of it anyway. She was strangled with her own rosary beads, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So that's a kind of a grisly kind of a story from the 19th century Portlaoise. And we have another one there. The first or the oldest fleshed bog body in Europe was found in County Laois in a bog out at Cashel, again just outside Portlaoise as well. And it dates back all the way back to the Bronze Age, and it may have been a king, a local king in the area that was ritually sacrificed in the bog, maybe due to climatic conditions or poor harvest or what have you. So, it stems all the way from Bronze Age Laois all the way up to 19th century Laois.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, you'll have to tell us more once the book is finished and come back and give us a full rundown and whatever you feel will be interesting to the audience out there. I'd love to speak about it more in detail.
That'd be great. I'd love to do that. And,
Yeah.
once the book is finished or ready for print, the pressure will be off, so I'll be able to speak a little bit more freely about it.
Do you have a deadline?
Well, I want to have it out for Christmas this year. That's the plan anyway.
Okay.
So it's kind of
Christmas 2022.
2022, exactly. So it's kind of like a little stocking filler, I suppose.
Absolutely.
So
Well, it'd be great for kids, I suppose. Well, even with the grisly tales, but
yeah,
I think that's something that we tend to censor in modern children's books. It's like, well, children like to be scared too, and
yeah, absolutely. It's as I said, it's a book for everyone.
it's thrilling.
Yeah, and it's a nice, ideal Christmas present.
That's great, and best of luck. I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. Well, look, thank you for joining me today, Seán. It was a pleasure, and hopefully we can do this again soon sometime.
Yeah, I'll just myself and Tom used to do a program called The Last Festung, and it's kind of, I suppose we call it a B-list podcast.
Yet to be released.
Very
off the cuff.
Very much
during the lockdown.
Yeah. When times were tough for everybody, I suppose. But anyway, thanks for having me on, Tom. Today.
I'm delighted to have you, Seán, and best of luck with the book, and look forward to seeing it in print. So please come back again soon. The Idiot Cosmos was produced by me, Thomas Byrne, at the Port Tarrington Enterprise Centre in Laois. I'd like to thank Mary and Danuta at the Centre for their invaluable assistance in helping make this a reality. Please join me again in my next edition. Thank you.